Goedemiddag, we gaan verder met het programma. Dit is de derde keer dat ik hem mag aankondigen. Hij loopt hier rond, werkelijk in alle bescheidenheid. Je zou bijna denken dat hij weet je, bij de catering hoort en de broodjes kwam brengen. Of de man van Spa Blauw. Maar 2 jaar geleden bij Eday in Amsterdam, kun je het misschien herinneren, was Mark Fletcher aanwezig en hij presenteerde daar het bedrijf Bloglines. Dat hij vlak daarvoor voor een veel te hoog bedrag. Hij zei dat he sold Bloglines way too expensive. Als je het zegt, moet je ook zeggen. To AskJeeves. You're not denying it, are you? Anyway, ever since then, Mark has changed his life, but not really. Has a new girlfriend. Invests in companies more now than he did before. Helps other entrepreneurs get started. Probably one of the most humble guys I've met. But an extremely successful serial entrepreneur. A software developer, an investor. Has over 20 years experience in software development and high tech. In 2007 Mark started, based on all that experience, startupping. Why does everybody give me the easy names? Startupping. A one-of-a-kind community resource. A one-of-a-kind community resource created for internet entrepreneurs by internet entrepreneurs. It is a place to share information, ask questions, and tap into the experience of others who have built and are building web businesses. I guess few people in the world are as equipped to help people start an internet business than Mark. In addition to running startupping, Mark is currently an early stage angel investor. So if you're looking for an investor, do you invest across Europe? Do you mean do you invest here, or do you only invest in the US?
I've only invested in the US so far.
But are you open to change your mind on that?
I'm open to change my mind. Sure.
If the offer is really good?
Well, if it's an exciting company, sure. I mean, that's what you look for, is a great opportunity.
Our money is just as green. Well, actually, it's got a little more colors. In 2003, Mark started Bloglines, as I just said, a free web-based news aggregation service. Mark was awarded the 2005 Wired Magazine Tech Innovator Rave Award. The speech for today that we asked Mark to deliver is, he'll talk about the process of starting an internet company in the 21st century. That's always good that you don't talk about how you should start one last century. That's great that they added that. Small, cheap, and fast is the name of the game. Mark will give some practical advice about what to do and what not to do. Technology, marketing, and finance will be covered. This is not your father's internet startup. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me again to introduce Mark Fletcher.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. This has been pretty fantastic. It's certainly grown over the last 2 years since the last time I was here in Amsterdam. So, my talk today will be on Startupping 2.0, which is lessons learned, birthing, and building web startups. First, though, I want to tell an anecdote about startup culture in Silicon Valley. As you see here, a bunch of T-shirts with mock-ups of the graphics of companies that I've started. There's a tradition in Silicon Valley, and it's been going on for quite a while now. In a world where starting a technology company has changed dramatically, as I'll talk about today, one thing has remained constant, and that is starting a company is all about the T-shirt. People fight for them, they prize them, and for better or worse, long after a company is gone, their ghosts survive in the form of T-shirts that people continue to wear. You should see my closet, it's full of these things. Luckily, none of my companies are ghosts yet, and so all of these T-shirts are somewhat valid. And where's the next slide? Here we go. Sorry about that. I've seen startups from the inside out, outside in, and basically all over the place. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience. I started out as an engineer in a couple of startups in the Valley. The last one was Diva, which was acquired by Sun Microsystems. I then went on to found 3 companies. For the introduction. First one was OneList, which is now Yahoo Groups, acquired by Yahoo in 2000. Second one was Bloglines, which was acquired by AskJeeves in 2003. And the third one is Startupping. And Startupping I started earlier this year as a resource for entrepreneurs to talk amongst themselves and share information. Being an entrepreneur oftentimes is a very lonely business. And so I would get emails from entrepreneurs asking me questions, and a recurring theme was basically, there's no place on the internet where we can talk amongst ourselves and share information. That's really the genesis of startupping, which I'm working on now. In addition to the companies that I've founded, I'm also an advisor to 3 companies, One True Media, TechDirt, and Wasabe. So basically the theme of all of these companies is that they're small, consumer-focused, web services-based firms. If you want to start a hardware company or database company, I'm probably not the guy to talk to, and this probably isn't going to be a useful presentation for you. So, I'll be talking about the various aspects of starting a company and current best thinking of best practices about it. But first I want to give a brief overview of some of the changes that have taken place over the last 30 years. We've really seen an incredible revolution in how companies are started and built. If you look at the graphics I have, it goes from IBM, which is a huge monolithic company that had hundreds of thousands of employees, took a lot of money to create and a lot of time to create, to the 1970s and 80s, where you started to see companies built in garages. It was really the garage creation myth came into its own back then. And then what we have now are what I call the kitchen table web businesses, where all you need is a laptop, a kitchen table, and your cat to start a company. And there have been several trends that have made this possible. What you're seeing is many employees for the old companies to small virtual teams these days, leveraging the power of the internet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Taking lots of money to start a company to virtual bootstrapping, whereas in the 90s, for example, it was common for internet companies to raise millions and millions of dollars. E-Groups, my company, raised $48 million before we were acquired. Whereas, contrast that with Bloglines, my last company before startupping, we did it start to finish $200,000. Previously, you'd see long release cycles, and now you're seeing rapid iterations. You'd see really taking advantage of the internet to push out new features, new bug releases on almost a daily basis, whereas before, with a software product, you'd be talking about a year release cycle. Everything's much more nimble and agile these days. And finally, the rise of free and standard software over custom tools before. It used to be that you'd have to roll your own solution, even in the 90s. But if you wanted a database for your software or for your internet service, you'd really have to do a lot of programming on your own. These days, while it's still not perfect, there are a lot of free software solutions, and that helps with several of the other aspects of business, being cheap, rapid iteration, etc. So before you start, you need an idea. And the first thing you need to do is what I call identify a genuine pain point. So it's easy for us nerds, and I'm a nerd, to get infatuated with technology and then try to build a business around that. I look at it as the opposite. You really need to look for a problem, and preferably one that you yourself are suffering from, and use that as a basis for starting a company. I'll give you examples for OneList and Bloglines. OneList, which is a free mailing list service. Back in 1997, I wanted to start a mailing list, but in order to do that, you had to have a computer connected to the internet, you had to run some arcane software. It was very, very difficult, and once you did that, it was a real challenge to get people to sign up to it. So OneList was my idea of how to make that easier. I was solving a problem for myself, but at that time I figured if I had that problem, other people would have the same problem. Bloglines, in 2003, when I was working on it, I had a bookmark list, basically of 100 sites that I'd go to every day that I was checking on, sites that I was interested in, friends, websites, news sites, things like that. And I'd have to go to that list every day just to see what changes have taken place. And that list was only getting longer, and the process was only taking longer. And that what's got me thinking, how can I solve this process? Bloglines was that. Bloglines is a news reader that lets you subscribe to websites. So instead of having to go to them every day and check for new content, the new content is pulled into Bloglines all in one place, and it only shows you new items. So it really speeds up the web browsing experience. Again, my thought process with that is I'm solving a problem that I have, and if I have it, other people probably have it as well. Another thing you must have when starting a company is passion for the idea. Doing a startup is hard. I cannot tell you how hard it is to do it. It will consume your life. It takes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years on end. It is unending pain. I mean, there's lots of good things with it too, but I've got to tell you, it's very, very difficult. And that's if you hope it's very difficult, because that means you're being successful. So you have to have a passion for the idea. If you don't have a passion for the idea, it just isn't going to work. You're just not going to be able to muster the energy to deal with this thing for years, 24 hours a day. Third thing I talk about is you must have a business model. And it doesn't mean you have to execute on one initially, and it doesn't mean it has to be very unique, but you should be thinking about the business model initially. There are two main business models for internet startups these days. There's the free ad-supported based revenue model, and then there's what's called the freemium model, which means as part of your services are free, and then you upsell additional services. You definitely should have an idea of what your business model is going to be before you start your company. Fourth, you should become educated. And what's great about the 21st century as opposed to the late 90s is that there are so many resources on the internet these days to take advantage of. There's so many blogs of venture capitalists, of angel investors, of other entrepreneurs. There are resources like Startuping, Y Combinator Hacker News, for example. Just tremendous resources. Read those. Get educated. The more you know, the better off you'll be. I mean, part of the thing is you don't want to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. You want to be able to make new and exciting mistakes instead. And then finally, this seems counterintuitive, but get another job. Starting a company is the riskiest thing you can ever do. And so part of my thought process is once you've decided to do a startup, try to mitigate that risk as much as possible. And one way of doing that is to moonlight. That's what I did with OneList, for example. We launched OneList in January of 1998, but I had a mortgage. I had a house. I could not afford to stop working at my regular job while I was doing this very risky startup. So what did I do? I would work at my regular job 8 or 10 hours a day, and then I would come home and I would work on OneList for another 8 hours a day, and then all day on the weekends. It's a horrible way to live, but if you don't have the money to just jump both feet into it, you can do it. And it is a good way to mitigate the risk. So one of the important aspects about starting a company is assembling your team. And that's really one of the things that has changed dramatically over the last 7 or 8 years. One of the things I like to tell people to do is to outsource as much as possible. There have been the rise of several different outsourcing solutions, as I talk about here, or mention here. Elance, Rent-A-Coder, and Mechanical Turk are just 3 options for creating a virtual team, really harnessing these internet services to outsource some of the work. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how I've done that. I'm not a graphic designer by any means. I can't draw at all. When I needed a logo for Startuping, I just went and put a bid out on Elance, or put a project up for bid on Elance. I got 12 bids in 24 hours, and I picked somebody from, I think it was Australia, and within 2 days I had a logo for $70. With Bloglines, I wanted a Windows program, a little notifier app that you could install on your computer, just to tell you when unread items are available in your account for Bloglines. I didn't want to learn how to program Windows. I didn't know anybody who was available to do Windows programming for me, so I wrote up a project and I put it up on Elance. Got several bids. 5 days later, a couple of guys from the Ukraine had written a wonderful little Windows application for me for $500. I couldn't get that done as cheaply or as quickly using any other way, certainly not by hiring anybody, and I was able to keep my fixed costs very low. Collaborate using internet tools. I really like virtual teams. Go where the talent is. For Bloglines, for example, we didn't have an office. We just communicated using a chat room. And we used Yahoo Groups and several other tools. So you're an internet startup. Use the internet, damn it. And as I say here, this is another interesting point. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Harness your users as really extended team members. Once you launch a consumer internet business, you're going to have all of these people using your service, and they're going to tell you what's right, they're going to tell you what's wrong. They're helpful. Utilize that. I think that's very important for success, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, hire a lawyer. I tried to do it very cheaply with OneList. I incorporated myself using some free tools. And while it saved money initially, at the end I had to go back and we had to redo a bunch of stuff. So it didn't really save much time or money. So that would be the one thing, or one of the things that I would suggest going ahead and spending some money on and a good lawyer. Another aspect, so let's talk about building the service. Be cheap. I am a cheap bastard, and so should you be. And that's one of the great things. Startups are getting cheaper all the time. The hardware is getting cheaper. You should never buy machines. You should utilize some of these interesting new services that are out on the internet right now. Amazon is doing some really interesting things with two services, S3 and EC2. They're horrible names, but what S3 does is it allows you to offload some of your storage needs. So like if you're serving large files like photos, for example, instead of buying machines or renting machines and paying for bandwidth and all that rigmarole, you can just offload it to Amazon very cheaply, and you don't have to worry about backups or anything like that. It's just a fantastic way to leverage some of these new tools on the internet to, again, save money. Free tools, all the free software out there. These days you really shouldn't be paying for software that you use to host your site. Between Linux and Apache and MySQL and Ruby on Rails, all of these technologies are fairly mature these days, and there are large communities of developers around them. So by using some of these standard free tools, it doesn't cost you money, and you can take advantage of this large pool of developer resources. As I mentioned before, don't have a virtual team. You don't need an office. Bloglines never had an office, so we didn't have to pay for rent. We just, everybody worked from home. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. You need to have a certain level of maturity, so you'll be able to trust your employees to be able to work on their own. But you're able to use chat rooms. Things like 37 Signals, Backpack, and Campfire are great tools for this to foster communication. You're an internet company, so you might as well embrace all aspects of the internet. Release early and release often. Now this is a huge point. I have what I call the 3-month rule. From idea to launch should take you no more than 3 months. And you're thinking that's probably some incredibly compressed period of time, and it is. Oftentimes you won't be able to develop your service fully, but you should be able to develop some kernel of your service and get it out there. And it really starts, really fosters the habit of releasing early and releasing often. If you just force yourself to get something out there initially as soon as possible. And a real key thing about doing that is that it involves your users sooner rather than later. As soon as you get something out there, as I mentioned before, you'll have users start using the service. And once users start using your service, they will start giving you feedback. And this is the most valuable thing that you can have. With Bloglines, for example, we were getting 100 emails a day with our users telling us what they liked and what they didn't like about the service and how it could be improved. This is hugely valuable to us. Oftentimes their ideas were much better than anything that we ever came up with, and most of our best features came from our users. When you get these ideas, so it's one thing to launch the service and start getting this feedback, but you absolutely have to act on the feedback. And that creates what I call a virtuous cycle. Because once you start acting on the feedback of what your users are telling you, they will see this in updates to the product, bug fixes to the service. They get excited about that. That ties them more closely to the service because it shows them in concrete manner that what they say matters, and it makes you look like a very responsive company. That ties them closer to you. They will start evangelizing your service, and it just feeds upon itself. This is hugely critical. A lot of companies fall down in this regard, I think, and it's just something you really should pay attention to. Fred Wilson is a venture capitalist in New York City, and he had a blog post recently on this very topic of running very cheap internet services. You'd think that venture capitalists would be concerned that now internet services are much cheaper to build, and he had a very good blog post about it, and this was one of the slides on it. And the slide was very interesting because it illustrates some useful points about being cheap. There are a few things about it. One is the cheaper you are at the beginning, the more options you have in terms of selling to another company or whether taking venture capital later. The more value you can build into your service before you actually take much outside investment, the better off you are. That means the less of your company that you actually have to give up. If you, for example, took $5 million without anything actually being live on the internet, you're probably going to give up a huge chunk of your company immediately to the venture capitalists, if you can even get them to fund you at this point. But if instead you spend $50,000, have a site up, and you can show that it's growing exponentially, for example, then you're in a much better position to either raise money at a higher valuation, which means that you give up less of your company to the investors, or just to be acquired at a lower amount and still end up with a large amount of money in your pocket. So it was part of Fred's post, which is great, and this slide, finally getting to it, was another interesting part. The x-axis here is basically time, and the y-axis is capital requirements, and this shows the difference between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. Basically, at some point, if your service is popular, you will need a lot of money, regardless of what century you're in. It's just you're able to delay that investment these days with the benefits of what I was just talking about. So let's talk about design. And first thing, don't reinvent the UI. We are 15 years into the internet revolution. There are several standards about how you're supposed to design a website. Don't go reinventing things. People expect if you have to log in to give your email address and password to use it. They expect that there's going to be a profile page. Don't try to be funky. Just don't reinvent it. Copying is good. Expose as much content as possible. So if you do have to have registration for your service, try not to hide everything behind a paywall or behind a registration wall. Try to show activity on the home page or on other publicly accessible web pages. What that does is that shows people who may be interested in registering for your service that there is activity going on, and it gives them an idea of what to expect. And it pays into my next point, which is do some SEO. SEO stands for search engine optimization, for those that don't know. And what that means is basically tailoring your website for search engines. Search engines can, if you're successful, drive a lot of traffic to your website. But there are some tricks that you should do in order to maximize your potential within an index. One of that is exposing as much content as possible without registration. Because if you have to register for a lot of content, then all the search engines aren't going to find it. It's just going to be a big black hole. There are several other easy tips that you can use, like tailoring the title of your web pages, for example. And there's several SEO websites out there that will mention or that will tell you these tips. So let's talk about registration. Do you even need it? A lot of websites will force registration when you don't even need it, and that's pointless. That limits your growth. If you do need registration, make it easy. Email address, password. I saw a study once where every additional question that you asked during the registration step cuts out 50% of your potential users. So just focus on email address, password. If you need additional information, get them past the registration step first, show them some kind of value, and then make it easy for them to understand that there's additional value for providing additional information. Room for ads. If you're going to go for the ad-supported business model, make sure that there's room in the design for the ads from the beginning. Adding advertisement ads later is oftentimes very jarring to the users, but if they see that there's advertising in the beginning, then they're more likely to at least accept it. And finally, I put a pointer up to Amy Jo Kim's presentation from eTech a couple of years ago, which you can see at this URL. Really what she does is she compares website design to game design. And it's just kind of an interesting way of seeing how to design a successful website using tips from arcade games. Raising money, the fun one. So, get educated on the type of financing. There's tons of information out there now that there wasn't in 1998 or 97. When I started, I'd never talked to a venture capitalist. I'd never seen a term sheet. I didn't know what the different parts of a deal were. I didn't know what was good, what was bad. I didn't know when I was being taken advantage of. I didn't know any of this stuff. This is all out there now. There are venture capitalists who are blogging on a regular basis. There are entrepreneurs that are blogging on a regular basis. Read this stuff. There are several types of financing, and what you go with really depends on where you are in your company. So friends and family is probably the easiest way to raise money. It can be good when you're just getting started, because your friends and family, well, they have a belief in you, so they don't need a presentation, they don't need a large pitch or whatever. It can be risky because if your idea goes down in flames, then you've just lost your parents' money, for example, which can cause some stress. So that's something to keep in mind. There are traditional angel investors. Angel investors are good, again, for amounts up to $500,000 or $1 million, although that's somewhat changing these days. Angel investors are good in that they also don't need presentations, they don't need to be pitched, they are not hands-on, and they generally will not offer a lot of value besides the money. Venture capitalists are probably the next step up in terms of financing. They will get you lots of money. They will require presentations, multiple presentations, investor pitches. They will take a large chunk of your company. They will be very involved, which can be good or bad depending on the situation. They will be on your board, and that makes sense, I think, these days for more later stage startups, not the earlier stuff. One of the interesting developments over the last few years are the rise of new funding sources. So you have, at least in the US, we've got the Y Combinator and Techstars. Over here in Europe, there's Seedcamp. And they don't fall into traditional angel investors, and they're certainly not venture capitalists. They're maybe something in between. What they do is they give you a little bit of money, but they foster community around startups, because they fund a large number of startups at the same time, often 10 to 12 in a season, and then they work on providing contacts into the venture community and other communities. So they provide a lot of non-monetary advantages, which is really interesting. These have just started over the last couple of years, so I think it remains to be seen whether they'll end up being successful or not. But it's certainly encouraging to see this kind of innovation. When raising money, you've got to ask how much. You've got to figure out, before you start pitching to anybody, whether it's your friends or family or angels or VCs or whatever, how much money do you need? And as I was talking about, be cheap. Try to go for minimize your expenses and don't go for a lot of money. It is unfortunately a trade-off. If you raise more money, that means that you can go longer without raising your next round, but at the same time you give up more of your company and reduce your possibilities in the future. So there is no hard and fast rule. It's just something you need to look at for your expenses. And I've got to remind you that raising money takes time. It takes a lot longer than you think it does, especially with venture capitalists in general. It just takes a long time. So don't think it's a 1-month process. Don't think it's a 2-month process. Think of it as a 4 or 5-month process. If it goes quicker than that, fantastic, but it will take a lot of time. Marketing is another aspect of starting a company that you need to be concerned with. And this is another area where you can be very cheap, certainly these days. As I say, PR is the cheapest marketing you can do. So that's issuing press releases and fostering relationships with the reporters. One of the very successful things that we did with Bloglines is that we really courted blogs. Really the way that I announced Bloglines and got the word out initially, it was that I looked for bloggers who were talking about these kinds of issues of information overload and trying to follow too many blogs. And I would look for these posts, and then I would make comments on the posts, and I would be, and they wouldn't be spammy comments, they would be intelligent comments responding to the concerns in the person's blog post. And then I'd say, for example, I would say, I completely agree with you. This is what I've done to solve the issue. It's Bloglines. Let's try to be informative while responding to these blog posts. There are several sites that are just designed to give publicity to sites. Dig and Reddit are one type of site, and Slashdot is a similar type of site. These sites are designed to give publicity to other websites. So try to get on those. Again, it's another free way to get the word out about your internet startup. And let traditional press find you. This is another change from the 90s even. Foster relationships with reporters, but don't necessarily spend a lot of time trying to pursue them. In the 90s, with OneList, we went out, we hired a PR firm, and we went on huge pitching sessions where we'd go and we'd cold call press reporters. And it would take a lot of time, and it cost money, and it generated some results. But these days, it's different. You let the press find you. You don't hire a big PR firm. Or if you do that later in the life of your startup after you've generated a lot more buzz. It's just easier to do it, well, not easier, but it's cheaper to do it using just responding to blogs and some of these other things. And in terms of marketing, I mean, the best thing you can do really is just focus on viral growth. If you view marketing as getting the word out, well, the more users using your site, the more they'll talk to their friends, and the more you'll grow. And so really just focus on anything that you can do to spike user growth and increase viral adoption. So what do I mean by viral adoption? That means anything that you can do to make your site more important to a given user if their friends also use the site. Easiest example of this is OneList, which is a mailing list provider. If I create a mailing list, it's no good if there's no subscribers to it. So I have a natural incentive to tell my friends that, hey, I've created this mailing list about lizards or whatever else, and try to get them to subscribe. It's this natural word of mouth that really drove the incredible growth that we saw with OneList. And you couldn't pay for that kind of growth. You still can't pay for that kind of growth. That's really kind of the holy grail. It's what you want to look for as much as possible. Get a blog. Every company should have a blog. It gives a voice, a personality to your startup. It helps people connect to your company. It makes your startup less a monolithic, faceless corporation. And it's a good way of getting information out about what's going on in your company. Everybody should have a blog. Finally, a new thing in the last year or two is what I call social network piggybacking. Facebook and MySpace are the two hot social networks in the Bay Area. There's Bebo in the UK, High Five, several others. One of the interesting things is that several companies have piggybacked off the growth of these social networks to really spike their user growth. I believe it was March, Facebook opened up their site to really encourage this even more. And so what we've seen really in the last 5-6 months is a whole new class of startups that are just based on tying into Facebook and really supercharging their growth that way. I'll give an example of this in a later slide. Partnering. Just don't do it. It's just not worth it. With OneList, I hired a VP of Biz Dev, a great guy, and he hired out a whole team, and they weren't able to do anything for our growth. We were already growing as we were growing from viral growth, and nothing that they did, through no fault of their own, was able to change our growth. You're developing a company, it's got to stand on its own at some point. So partnering, I strongly believe, at least initially, is just generally a distraction more than not. The exit. So this is one that everybody seems to be interested in. Do you need one, first off? If you develop a successful company, well, do you need to sell out to somebody? And part of that is a lifestyle question for you. Part of it is how your business is built. But that is, don't always assume that you need to sell out or an IPO or whatever. There are several small companies that have no plans to be acquired, no plans to IPO, but they just generate cash and they generate salaries for their employees, and everybody's just happy. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just great. I'll tell you a little bit about my OneList versus Bloglines experience. With OneList, at that point we were called eGroups. We were hell-bent on an IPO. We had just raised $42 million in a third round. We filed our S1 in March of 2000, which is the big document you need before you IPO. 2 weeks after that, the NASDAQ crashed. And so we realized fairly quickly that we couldn't IPO, but we were all set to IPO. So this is a very concerning situation because we were burning through cash fairly quickly. Part of going IPO is a way to raise a lot of cheap money. What we were able to do, luckily, in that case, was to sell ourselves to Yahoo, and that process started because we shared a board member. Mike Moritz was on eGroup's board as well as Yahoo's board and was able to do the introductions. And we were able to do that fairly quickly. If we hadn't done that, then there would have been a large amount of pain in the company. We would have had to have pared back spending and probably let a lot of people go at that point. Bloglines, completely different. Bloglines, I had one employee. I had a few consultants, but one employee. It was not my plan to be acquired. It was just my plan to just develop this nice business. AskJeeves came along and was very interested in us, and it became apparent at some point during the talks that it would make sense to explore an acquisition. But I wasn't quite sure how to do that. I'm a horrible negotiator. It's just I hadn't been directly involved in the eGroups acquisition, and that was kind of a unique case anyways. So what I did was I hired an investment banker. And an investment banker is a guy or a firm whose job it is to sell your company. And they do that by identifying potential acquirers, contacting those acquirers, telling them about your company, oftentimes developing a lot of marketing material, and then essentially trying to create an auction, try to get the price as high as you can for your company. So that's what I did with Bloglines, which was an interesting experience. What you do is you end up interviewing a lot of them first, and that was eye-opening because most of them don't understand what your business is. So what I ended up looking for was somebody that completely understood my business without me having to explain it. They're going to sell your company. They have to be the best salesman of your company. So you've got to really make sure that they understand your business. And once you have an investment banker, generally the way that they work is they take a cut of whatever acquisition price you get. So another thing to keep in mind is that you can negotiate that with them as well. And so part of that whole process is don't sell, be bought. That's kind of an overarching theme. It's very hard to get an auction going if nobody's interested in you. So it's just part of what investment bankers do for you. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the sad truth about being acquired. So, an unfortunate fact is that a lot of times a company, once it's acquired, will either stagnate or die. Many reasons for it, but that's just what happens. One example is eGroups. When eGroups was acquired, eGroups was my first company, OneList. Acquired by Yahoo. Yahoo didn't put any resources towards the company and has been in maintenance mode for the last 7 years. It has not improved at all. So you should keep this in mind while going through the acquisition process. Oftentimes, at least for me, when I do a company, I get so tied up into it, it becomes my identity. This is something you're doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You live it, you breathe it, you eat it, you drink it. So it can be, well, heartbreaking probably isn't too strong a word if you see your company, this thing that you've worked years and years and years to build up, just either stagnate or die. You should keep that in mind and try to divorce yourself from these feelings. But also, when negotiating an acquisition, if you go that way, keep that in mind for any type of deal that you do with the acquiring firm. Make sure that part of your acquisition is not contingent upon your company doing much better afterwards, or what's called an earn-out, because oftentimes that may not happen. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of Web 2.0 companies that are doing some of this stuff. First is SmugMug. SmugMug is a photo sharing site. Flickr is another photo sharing site. SmugMug, I think, tries to position themselves as a higher end kind of Flickr, as a more premium version. Hosting images is hugely bandwidth intensive, and it takes a lot of disk space. It costs a lot of money. SmugMug switched to using Amazon's S3 service as opposed to storing the images themselves. They've saved, in the first year that they've used S3, $1 million with not having to buy new hardware, not having to deal with all these bandwidth resources, really leveraging some of these new services on the internet just to save. I mean, $1 million is a huge amount of money for this self-funded company, and it ensures that they continue to be profitable. iLike is a much newer company. They started, I believe, 1.5 years ago. And what's interesting about iLike, it's a music recommendation service, is that they've really piggybacked off Facebook, one of these social networks that I was talking about earlier, to hyper charge their growth. The Facebook API came out in April, and iLike was one of the first companies to take advantage of it and build connection between their service and iLike. The first day that they did this on Facebook, they got 40,000 new users. And over the last 5 months, this number I believe is correct, they've gotten 7 million users off Facebook. Facebook, I believe, has 30 or 40 million users. But it's an incredible way of hypercharging your growth, as this example is. Now, iLike is an actual service, and you can't just use Facebook to hypercharge the growth of a know-nothing service. You actually have to have something there. But it is a good way to build viralness into your service. And finally, a couple of months ago, I wrote up a whole bunch of startup commandments, about 25, and I'll just mention 5 of them here. And these are kind of not tongue-in-cheek, but they were meant to be illustrate a few different points of starting a company. The first one, your idea is not new. And I don't think that necessarily is very important. Anything that you can think of has been thought of before. Now, don't be discouraged about that, because I don't believe the idea is the most important thing in the world. It's the execution that really matters. In both OneList and Bloglines, there was competition before I even launched. But I was able to execute better than the existing competition and take over the market. So don't get hung up on your idea so much. Just get out there and execute. You'll have at least one catastrophe every 3 months. This is the way it is with startups. You think the world is ending. Actually, doing a startup means makes you feel like you're manic depressive. You have really high highs and you have really low lows. You know, one day you can be on the top of the world, the next day the world is ending because your hard drive crashed on the service and your users are screaming at you. You have to expect this. It will happen, and it will happen regularly. So competition, if you don't pay attention to it, they'll crush you. If you do pay attention to it, they'll do nothing. So that seems like counterintuitive or an oxymoron or another fancy word I don't know. But what I'm trying to say with this is have an eye on the competition, but don't drive your business based on what your competition is doing. Don't react to them. Execute on your own plan, and then they'll have to follow you. That's always worked for me. This is what I strongly advise. As I mentioned before, it's being a manic depressive, except you can't really take drugs for it. Abject terror, overwhelming joy, monstrous greed. I mean, these are just some of the emotions that you will feel doing a startup. And so this is crazy, right? I mean, you've got to be wrong in the head to start a company, but it really is incredibly fun, incredibly gratifying when it works. I would rather do, there's nothing I would rather do. And so, with that, whoops. Say go forth and let the best t-shirt win. And thank you very much.
Well, actually, I have a few questions from the audience, just 2 or 3 before, because there's that many people here. First of all, how many people in the audience are actually thinking about starting a company? If you could please raise your hand, unless your current boss is sitting right next to you. Then just kind of nod. I see one finger over there from one girl. Then do you see any hands going up? A few.
Anyone?
Anyone? Is anyone thinking about starting over there? A couple of girls. Why are only girls starting companies? It's actually a good thing. That's about it. You just gave this whole thing to a couple of people stuck in a job, going for their 13th month and then vacation pay. I actually have one question for you. Seriously, there was one thing I wanted to know was, you seem kind of a little bit bitter when you talk about the one list Topica. Well, the time when he started one list, I was living in San Francisco, and one of my friends worked for Topica, one competitor. Another one actually worked for e-groups, which you ended up buying, I think.
Right.
Before you sold to Yahoo.
Yep.
You seem to be pretty bitter about that time, although I think you made a ton of money, so what's the...
I did. Did I appear bitter?
Well, not bitter, but more like you're having more fun now with the smaller money going in, less venture capitalists, starting, the Web 2.0 style.
Well, it's because I've done it before, it's less nerve-wracking, for example, and in my experience, I had lots of people telling me I was an idiot when I was doing one list in e-groups, for example, and I had believed them, and which isn't very fun.
So you're enjoying yourself more now. That's kind of
yes, exactly. That's all.
So now there's less people calling you an idiot?
No, I think lots of people call me idiots, but
you're just having more fun. You don't care anymore now.
Yeah.
More so. Okay. Less self-aware, probably more feeling stronger. Any question from the audience? 2 questions from Mark before we go. I'll go over here. One from the lady. One from this gentleman.
Okay, you said that partnering, you were quite opposed to that, but you are very in favor of piggybacking. What's exactly the difference between those 2 strategies?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's just a question of by partnering, I think, of terms where you have to pursue a partner, you have to spend time building a business deal, revenue sharing. There's just a lot of energy built into creating these kinds of relationships. Piggybacking up a social network doesn't require the agreement of MySpace or Facebook. It's just something you can do immediately without them even caring. So it's a much quicker thing to do, and it doesn't require a lot of time on your part.
Yeah, the lady over there had the same question, so she let go. I had one final question.
Sure.
If you think about, do you see any how do you look at Europe versus the US when you look at entrepreneurship? Just looking at this audience in the US, if we would have done this, if we do this now in Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
It will be the opposite. I'm not saying anything is better or worse. Whatever makes you happy in life, that's what you should go for.
I think, because I live in Silicon Valley, I have a very skewed view of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is just crawling with entrepreneurs. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting an entrepreneur. So I don't think that's the way it is.
Can't swing a dead cat?
I love cats. I have 2 cats. It's an expression.
Never heard it, so I'm just checking.
It just means that the place is crawling with entrepreneurs. That's not the case in the rest of America, and so it's difficult for me sometimes to divorce myself from that and compare the United States with Europe. There are definitely some interesting things going on in Europe. I mean, Skype showed the world that you can do a very, very successful startup in Europe. It just doesn't matter.
If you sell it to an American company for an overinflated price, yes.
And
who cares?
The problem is...
I'm just saying an American bought it in the end. It's not like they actually went public themselves and monetized it.
No, that's true, but there's nothing wrong with an acquisition, right?
I'm not saying, because some of their shareholders are my shareholders, so I'm not mocking them, I'm just saying.
Right. So I think you're going to see a lot more innovation, and the great thing about the internet is that it doesn't really matter where something starts.
So you're optimistic about Europe?
I think so, yes. From what I've seen, it's just, it's great. I mean, you have conferences like this, which is just fantastic. I mean, I get so much energy just walking around the floor here. Just all of these cool things happening.
And we'll end on that note. Thank you very much, Mark Fletcher.
Thank you.
We hebben nu 5 minuten alleen looptijd van deze zaal naar de andere. Er zijn 2 workshops. In deze zaal gaat Niels de Kind verder van Telegraaf Media Groep. In de andere zaal, ergens in je boek staat, is een andere workshop van iemand anders die niet Niels de Kind is. Maar die is ook leuk. Daar moet je ook, maar hier is het ook te gek. Dus ik heb geen idee wat er verder gebeurt. Dit zijn de workshops. En dit zijn wij niet. Had je het al doen? Wij zijn weer terug daarna om 5:30 met de laatste keynote van Tara Hunt. Dan krijgen we ook nog eens een keer een vrouw op het podium. De groep niet.